Hello Daily Drafters and welcome back to the channel for the continuation of the Brothers War Limited set review. Yesterday we took a look at green and today we'll be finishing the card by card set review by taking a look at every single colorless card and land in the set. Don't forget that I'm reviewing these cards before the set has released and before anyone has had the chance to play with them. So I will obviously be getting a couple of the cards wrong, but over the course of the entire format, you can tune back into the channel to see how I've adjusted the value of some of these cards over time. In addition to reviewing every single card in this set for Limited, I'll be producing archetype guides, pre-release primers, and other content related to the release of the Brothers War. So if you've stumbled across this video and any or all of that sounds of interest to you, feel free to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all things Brothers War in preparation for its release. Lastly, before we dive in, I will be using the Limited Resources letter grade system to grade each of these cards here today. And if you're unfamiliar with that system, you can find that information in this video's description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's take a look at today's first colorless card. First up we have Aeronaut's Wings, which is 2 mana for an artifact equipment at common. It gives equipped creature +1/+0 and flying, and it equips for 2 mana. At 2 mana to cast and 2 mana to equip, I think this is just a little too expensive for my taste. You'll hear me say a lot this video, but the fact that all these colorless cards are artifacts in an artifact heavy set might make them more playable than they seem on their face, but I doubt you'll have room to include this card very often. I'll give it a D+. Next up we have Argivian Avenger, which is 6 mana for a 5/5 artifact creature shapeshifter at uncommon. You can pay 1 and then until end of turn, it gets -1/-1 and gains your choice of flying, vigilance, death touch, or haste. This is a neat little ability. I'm not sure we've ever seen an ability with a downside and an upside like this before, or at least not recently. That makes it a tough one to grade, but a 6 mana 5/5 isn't outstanding, but with Power Stones I'm thinking of this more of a 5 mana 5/5 or so, and the ability is upside. Paying 1 to make it a 4/4 flyer is nice, and you can pay this multiple times if you need to in the same turn, like paying 2 to make it a 3/3 flying haste. All that said, I think the fact that it shrinks when you activate it, and it being a bit expensive makes this a tough include when it lacks synergy in the format. I'll give it a C-. Next up we have Cityscape Leveler, which is 8 mana for an 8/8 artifact creature construct at Mythic Rare. It has Trample, and it says when you cast this spell, and whenever Cityscape Leveler attacks, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent, its controller creates a tapped Power Stone token, and it unearths for 8 mana. Wow, this is a great card. 8 mana 8/8 trample that blows up a permanent when it ETBs when you cast it, notably not when it unearths, but it does do it also when it attacks, and it does have unearth. They get a Power Stone, but like, who cares when you kill their biggest threat on the board? There's really no downside to this thing. It's an A+. Next up is Energy Refractor, which is 2 mana for an artifact at common. When it ETBs, you draw a card, and for 2 generic mana, you can add 1 mana of any color. So this thing kind of filters your mana by making you pay 2 to get 1 of any color on the other side, but I don't think that's why this card will see play. It will see play, however, because it draws a card on ETB and has tons of synergy in the format. I don't think this is worth running in a deck with 0 synergy, but in a red-black sacrifice deck or decks that care about artifacts entering, this will be quite good, and in those decks, I think it's a solid C. Next up is Goblin Firebomb, which is 1 mana for an artifact at common. It has Flash, and you can pay 7, tap, and sacrifice Goblin Firebomb to destroy target permanent. I think you care more about the fact that this is a cheap 1-drop artifact that you can cast at instant speed than the destroying a permanent mode, although that mode is nice upside. In a deck that needs cheap artifacts for synergy, this is probably fine, but not outstanding. I'll give it a C-. Next up is Levitating Statue, which is 2 mana for an artifact at uncommon. It has flying, and it says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Levitating Statue, and for 2 generic mana, you can have it become a 1/1 construct artifact creature until end of turn. Well, you've got to know when this will be good and when it won't, but we've seen effects like this before where non-creatures get animated via triggers, and this doesn't quite get animated that way, but it does get bigger with triggers. And it flies. If you have a deck that can trigger this a solid 8 to 10 times, it will be a problem for your opponent, and in that deck, I'll give it a C+. Next up is Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter, which is 3 mana for a 1/2 legendary artifact creature Thopter at rare. It has flash, it has flying, and it says you may cast colorless spells and artifact spells as though they had flash, and whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast that spell is greater than Liberator Urza's Battlethopter's power, put a +1/+1 counter on Liberator. Boy, is that a mouthful. But so this is a clear build around. If you have no other colorless or artifact spells, this wouldn't be that great. Although it is important to note that it gets counters off of any spell, not just colorless or artifact spells, which is pretty nice. You really just need like 2 triggers for this to start being great, and its flash text is pretty decent in artifact and colorless heavy decks. Overall, if you build around this card effectively, I think it has a pretty big impact on the game. I'll give it a B. Next we have the Mightstone and the Weakstone, which is 5 mana for a legendary artifact Power Stone at rare, and when it enters the battlefield you choose one. You draw 2 cards, our target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn, and it taps to add 2 colorless mana, and that mana can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells. So this is basically 5 mana for 2 Power Stones that kill a creature on ETB or let you draw 2 cards. Both of those modes actually seem quite good to me. This is another one of the meld pairs in the format, but again, we'll ignore that for limited. I think this is actually a pretty good quote-unquote spell in pretty much any deck. I'll give it a B+. Next we have Mine Worker, which is 2 mana for a 2/1 artifact creature assembly worker at common. You can tap it to gain 1 life, and if you control creatures named Power Plant Worker and Tower Worker, you gain 3 life instead. So these other 2 creatures are also both colorless commons that we'll see here shortly, and I really doubt you'll ever be able to assemble the proverbial Tron in the format. I just don't think it's worth including potentially multiple copies of subpar cards to achieve a mild boost in power. So I'll grade these 3 cards as if you'll never have all 3 on the battlefield at the same time, and this 2 mana 2/1 with very minor upside probably just gets a D+. Next we have Portal to Phyrexia, which is 9 mana for an artifact at Mythic Rare, and when Portal to Phyrexia enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures, and at the beginning of your upkeep you may put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. So this is an absolute ton of mana, but boy does it pay you off. Build your deck with ramp and power stones if you draft this card to really maximize its effect, and to make it happen earlier. If your opponent doesn't have any creatures when you cast this, at that point in the game, there's gotta be some decent targets on the graveyard that you can constantly reanimate each turn, and if they do have a board, this catches you up pretty darn quickly. I'll grade this as if you have consistent enough ways to make it cheaper at 7 or even 6 mana, and in those decks, this is an A. Next we have Power Plant Worker, which is 5 mana for a 4/4 artifact creature assembly worker at common, and you can pay 3 generic mana to have it get +2/+2 until end of turn, and if you control creatures named Mine Worker and Tower Worker, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it instead, activate only once each turn. So here's another one of those common collect them all creatures, and this is a 5 mana 4/4 that can be a 6/6 if you dump some mana into it. Seems a little clunky and not really worth it to me. I'll give it a D+. Next we have Reconstructed Thopter, which is 3 mana for a 2/1 artifact creature Thopter at uncommon. It has flying, and it has an unearth for 2 generic mana. We've talked about the fact that there have been a decent amount of 3 mana 2/1 flyers lately with slight upside, but I think this upside of unearthing it for 2 isn't quite enough for me to be excited about playing it. A 2/1 flyer will beat your opponent down on some boards, but on others, it will be far too expensive to have any more of its impact. I'll give this a C-. Next up is Slagstone Refinery, which is 4 mana for an artifact at uncommon, and whenever Slagstone Refinery or another non-token artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, or is put into exile from the battlefield, create a tapped Power Stone token. For a whopping 4 mana, you can potentially make a few Power Stones later in the game. You have to really care about Power Stones and have a ton of synergy with them for this card to be remotely worth it. And maybe there's some sort of cute combo you can assemble, but I'll just wait to see that from my opponent. I think this is a D. Next we have Spectrum Sentinel, which is 1 mana for a 1/2 artifact creature soldier at uncommon. It has protection from multicolored, and it says whenever a non-basic land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. So we can almost ignore the entire text of this card and ask ourselves, do we want a cheap 1-mana artifact in our deck? Pro multicolored probably doesn't matter too much, and your opponents will usually have maybe one non-basic land in their deck on average. I don't think this is very good. I'm giving it a D. Next up is the Stasis Coffin, which is 3 mana for a legendary artifact at rare. You can pay 2 mana, tap this, and exile it, and then you gain protection from everything until your next turn. This seems to be a little bit of a one-turn buyout in super controlling decks. Remember, this protection just grants your face that ability, not your permanents or creatures. So it basically reads 2 mana, tap, and exile, and if you lose the game this turn, instead you don't. Doesn't seem horrible in a super controlling deck, but I think it's a sideboard card when you're control going up against like mid-range or something, and in that case, maybe it's like a C-. Next we have Steel Exemplar, which is 5 generic mana for a 4/4 artifact creature wizard at uncommon. It has trample, and it enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it, unless 2 or more colors of mana were spent to cast it. This is a 5 mana 6/6 trample if you only use a maximum of 1 color of mana to cast it, or a 5 mana 4/4 trample otherwise. My guess is that you will probably have this be a 6/6 like 30% of the time, and that's really my only interest in playing this card. Maybe there will be a bunch of monocolored / colorless decks in the format that I think this might be a decent curve topper for, but until I see those decks, I don't think this is that great. I'll give it a D+. Next up is the Stone Brain, which is 2 mana for a legendary artifact at rare. You can pay 2 mana, tap it, and exile it to choose a card name, search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for up to 4 cards with that name and exile them. That player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way, activate only as a sorcery. This is a constructed sideboard card, it's not for limited, don't put it in your deck, it's an F. Next we have Stone Retrieval Unit, which is 4 mana for a 2/3 artifact creature construct at common, and when it enters the battlefield you create a tapped Power Stone token. If you're lacking for Power Stone creators in a deck that really needs them, this seems fine to include. If you already have a bunch of ways to create Power Stones and you're just trying to jam this in your deck as one more, I don't think it's that great. I'll give it a C-. Next up is Su-Chi Cave Guard, which is 8 mana for an 8/8 artifact creature construct at uncommon. It has Vigilance, it has Ward 4, and when it dies, add 8 colorless mana. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. An 8 mana 8/8 Vigilance Ward 4 is already a huge body that your opponent will more than likely have to trade off in combat with. Its last line of text is probably not super relevant most of the time, but boy, when it is, it really is. I think its baseline is quite good, and its upside can be game winning. I think this is actually a B. Next up is Supply Drop, which is 3 mana for an artifact at common. It has Flash, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. You can pay 4 mana, tap, and sacrifice this to draw a card. This is a cute little combat trick that we can also cash in later for a card, and it's an artifact, so it has synergies in the format. That being said, it's just a little expensive. I wish it granted First Strike or something as well. I just don't think this is as good as other combat tricks in the format. I'll give it a D+. Next up is Swiftgear Drake, which is 5 mana for a 2/4 artifact creature Drake at common. It has flying and haste, and when it enters the battlefield, put up to 1 target card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. I don't think the second line of text on this card is relevant enough to adjust its grade at all more than just a 5 mana 2/4 flying haste would be, which honestly isn't great. I don't think this card is worth it for the cost. I'm giving it a D. Next up is Symmetry Matrix, which is 4 mana for an artifact at uncommon, and it says whenever a creature with power equal to its toughness enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1 mana. If you do, draw a card. So this is a clear build around card, and I really don't know what percentage of creatures in the format this triggers off of. Maybe there's enough to have a cute build around deck where you get value from this card, but I'm just not thinking there will be. I'll start this at a build around C, but again, you'll know when you want it. Next up is Thran Powersuit, which is 2 mana for an artifact equipment at uncommon. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each aura and equipment attached to it, and has Ward 2, and it has Equip for 2. We haven't really seen a whole lot of super playable equipment so far in this set, and this is probably for some sort of Voltron commander deck. This is probably 2 mana and 2 to equip for +1/+1 and Ward 2 most of the time, and that's not good. If you've got like 3 or 4 other playable equipments in your deck, maybe it's worth running, but I doubt it. I'm giving it a D. Next up is Thran Spider, which is 3 mana for a 2/4 artifact creature spider at rare. It has reach, and when it enters the battlefield, you and target opponent each create a tapped Power Stone token, and for 7 mana, you can look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it into your hand, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So we have a 3 mana 2/4 reach that gives us a Power Stone, and unfortunately our opponent too, and can basically draw a card for 7 mana. The stats aren't bad, but I really don't like giving my opponents things for free. What if it's the last mana they need to cast one of those huge 9 mana prototype cards? That's a disaster for me. Maybe if the ability was like 3 or 4, I would consider running it, but as it is, I'm just going to go ahead and give it a D+. Next up we have Tower Worker, which is 3 mana for a 1/3 artifact creature assembly worker at common. It has reach, and it can tap to add a colorless mana, but if you control creatures named Mine Worker and Power Plant Worker, add 3 colorless mana instead. So here's the last creature in the cycle of common collect 'em all creatures, and here we have a 3 mana 1/3 reach that can add a colorless if you want. This might be the best of the 3, maybe? But that still isn't saying much. It's not really worth an include on its own. I'm giving it a D+. That's it for all the colorless cards, and now we're on to lands, beginning with Argoth Sanctum of Nature, which is a land at rare. And it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a legendary green creature. It taps for green, and you can pay 2 and 2 green, tap it, and create a 2/2 green bear creature token, then mill 3 cards. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is the last card in one of our meld pairs in the format, but again, we'll ignore its meld text for limited. So we have a green land that likely ETBs tapped in most decks that can give you a 2/2 later in the game, but at the cost/benefit of milling you for 3. You probably can't activate this much more than maybe 3 times before you really do get into the risk of milling yourself, but I really don't think you ever cut this from a green deck. I'm giving it a C+. Next up we have Blast Zone, which is a land at rare. It enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it. It taps to add colorless, and you can pay XX and tap it to put X charge counters on Blast Zone. Then you can pay 3, tap it, and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. So this is a reprint from War of the Spark, and it's a bit of a tough one to grade. The good news is that this is an artifact heavy set, and you might not be as hampered by the fact that this only creates colorless mana, but also you have to dump a huge amount of mana into this over the course of several turns to eventually get a mini board wipe that affects both people, because it destroys everything equal to the amount of counters, not less than or equal to. I think if your mana can swing it, it's a fine include, but it's not a priority or anything. I'll give it a C. Next up we have Demolition Field, which is a land at uncommon. It taps to add a colorless, and you can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it to destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. That land's controller may search their library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. You may search your library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Is this just a functional reprint of Field of Ruin? I'm not sure why this isn't just called Field of Ruin. I think it does the exact same thing, but either way, there aren't really enough non-basics to care about in limited to justify running this card. Maybe out of the sideboard if they've got an important non-basic, but I'm just going to go ahead and give this an F. Next up is Evolving Wilds, which is a land at common, and you can tap and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Good old trusty Evolving Wilds is back, and it's usually fine. This helps you fix your mana, is really never a bad include. It's a C. Take it over some middling commons and filler, and you'll be fine. Next up we have Fortified Beachhead, which is a land at rare. And when it enters the battlefield, you may reveal a soldier card from your hand. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you revealed a soldier card this way, or you control a soldier. It taps to add white or blue, and you can pay 5 and tap it to have soldiers you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So this is a decent little dual land for the soldiers deck. It's got a lot of utility, and I'm glad they made it dual and not just one of the 2 colors. I don't think I would take this land as a pull into the soldiers deck, but if I was already in the soldiers deck, this would be a pretty high pick for me. I don't think you really need to pick it any higher than about a C in the draft, because no one but the soldiers deck drafter is going to want this really. Next up is Hall of Tagsin, which is a land at rare. It taps to add colorless. You can also pay 1 and tap it to add 1 of mana of any color, and you can pay 4 and tap it to create a tapped Power Stone token. This is a decent little repeatable Power Stone maker, and if the game goes long, the Power Stones that it makes can actually keep paying for this activation, effectively making it free at some point. If your mana can swing this card and you are in a deck that needs Power Stones, I think this is actually a pretty good include. I'll give it a C+. Next up is Mishra's Foundry, which is a land at rare. It taps to add Colorless, and you can pay 2 mana to have it become a 2/2 Assembly Worker artifact creature until end of turn. It's still a land. You can also pay 1 and tap it to give target attacking Assembly Worker +2/+2 until end of turn. Creature lands are always nice in limited formats because they're effectively another spell in your land slot. 2 mana to make this a 2/2 seems a bit irrelevant in a lot of scenarios, and I really don't know how many playable assembly workers that this last ability will work with. If you have 3 or 4 good assembly workers that the last ability cares about, it's probably worth including, and in that deck, it's probably a C. Next up we have Tocasia's Dig Site, which is a land at common. It taps to add Colorless, and you can pay 3, tap it to surveil 1. I like this ability tacked on to one of my lands, especially in a set with Power Stones to make it seem cheaper. Again, with all these lands that produce colorless mana, your mana base has to be able to support it. There's not a ton of fixing in this set, but in those decks that can, this is a solid C. And lastly, we have a cycle of lands at rare here in this set, 4 of them that you see on your screen now. We call them the Pain lands. They either tap for a colorless mana, or you can tap it for 2 different colors of mana, either blue or black in the case of Underground River here. And if you do that, it deals 1 damage to you. So we saw the first 6 of these in Dominaria United, and now they're finishing the cycle with the final 4. You can take these at about the level that you take filler commons, and to me, that puts them around a C. Before we wrap up here, I did want to mention that there are 63 additional cards in this set that will appear in booster packs on MTG Arena called Retro Artifacts. These cards are similar to the Mystical Archive cards that we saw in Strixhaven in that there's guaranteed to be exactly 1 of these in each pack. All 63 of these cards are reprints, and I will not be including dialogue in any of my set review videos going over each of these cards. However, if you're interested in my grade for these 63 cards, I've included those grades in the description of this video. That'll do it for today's portion of the Brothers War set review. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you tomorrow for more daily draft content.